Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about the world of data analytics. We'll look into why it's so hard and how to make it better, how to get more from your data analytics practice. To discuss all that, I'm joined by two people who know a lot about the topic. With me is Bill Schmarzo, customer advocate, data management incubation at Dell. Hello to you, Bill.
Hello, James. How you doing? Good to see you on the Zoom box.
Absolutely, good to see you as well. Also with me today is Andi Mann, Chief Technology Officer, CTO at Qumu. Andy, happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday, James. Bill, so good to talk to you again. One day we'll do this in person, I suspect, but it's great to see you, like Bill said, in the Zoom box.
We should all do this in person someday. I see
Oh,
that. Let's put that on our list for sure.
yeah, exactly. I'm up for it.
So, data analytics. I mean, enterprises everywhere are struggling with getting the most from data analytics. I mean, why is it so hard? Is it data in silos? Is it lack of scalability? Are humans actually just resisting the metrics? Is it lack of data prep? I mean, why is it still so hard here in the year 2021? Andy, what's holding us back?
Well, I mean, I'll point out to start with, there's a lot of industries or at least individual businesses that are actually doing very well with data. And I would cite, for example, retail as one industry that's taking a lot of data. And they have a lot of data, getting it especially from their web stores and so forth, but even from in-person, point of sale systems and so forth, and munging that with credit cards. And so lots and lots of good insight into customer behavior. But yeah, you mentioned a couple of things there, James. Disconnected data silos. That's a big part of it. It's hard to get deep correlation of data if you don't have the ability to correlate disparate data sets. And so much of the insight you get is from this correlation of different data sets. Digging into one data set is one thing, but if you can correlate data, think about point of sale systems, credit cards, and loyalty cards. So, the loyalty card data and the point of sale data, and then the credit card data, that gives you much more information than just point of sale, right? So you start to see who's doing it, how often they're buying, what type of purchases they're making, rather than just one-off transactions. I think there's, I don't want to say a failure of imagination, but a difficulty seeing the possibilities. I think people don't know what to do with data. We know some of the obvious stuff, like efficiencies in a production line, or repeat emails to a interested customer who may have abandoned a cart, sending them a discount for that cart item. Some of this sort of stuff is pretty straightforward. But when you get to more complex things around supply chain efficiencies, around production efficiencies, around sales tracking and efficiency, it's hard to see for a lot of people what the possibilities are, because they're not data scientists, and the tools are not awesome yet. It takes technologists to use them in a real significant way. So there's some of the things that I see are holding back people from doing analytics in a better way.
You talk about the fact that it takes technologists. I hear about this theme a lot, the democratization of technology, where some of the staff is now getting into data analytics. It doesn't take a data scientist always. It seems like that is going to be something that's going to move us.
Yeah, some of the tools that we're seeing come out, and it's starting to mature, right? And just by the way, Excel has to be the best data analytics platform anyone's ever used.
Right, timelessly.
So what I meant was the best database anyone's ever used. But yeah, the tools are getting better, but I really think they're not there yet to really get the most out of them. It's what I can see so far is that it's too technical for a business manager to just grab a data set, drop it in and go, "Ooh, look, my sales efficiency is dropping." That's, I think, a problem.
Bill, I would ask you the same question. What's holding us back? And I have a pet theory, if you could weigh in on this a little bit. I think that we humans are emotional creatures, and we have these metrics in front of us. We still want to run things by gut and by the seat of our pants. Is that part of the problem, or are people getting past that now? What is holding us back in the largest sense?
Sure. So a couple of things jump to mind. One is I still am amazed at how few organizations really thoroughly understand how they create value. And what are the KPIs and metrics around which they want to try to measure that value creation effectiveness. It's a problem in the world of AI, because when we have too narrow of a set of KPIs against what you're trying to optimize an AI model, we get all kinds of unintended consequences and confirmation bias and other kinds of things. So organizations really struggle with, when we talk to them about data, right? I hate the company that says, we want to be data driven. I'm like, no, you don't. You want to be value driven. You want to use data to drive value. So how does your organization create value? So, I teach a class at Menlo College and at University of San Francisco around how do you think like a data scientist? And the first part of that class is all about understanding how the organization creates value. How do they, what are the KPIs and metrics? Who are the stakeholders trying to make those decisions, and how do they measure effectiveness? So first off, I think the whole conversation needs to start with how are we going to create value, right? What are the problems we're trying to solve? And then, like Andy said, then trying to envision where and how data and analytics can help solve that problem. The second thing I would say, and Andy hit this really interesting. Andy said that retail's doing really well with data. And historically, they have. I was working with retailers back in the 80s and 90s, and they were some of the first who had the electronic point of sale systems. They were some of the first people to embrace data warehousing and business intelligence. And I think what you find in a lot of these retailers is a culture that they're willing to sort of look at data and make decisions based on data. They've got a really good understanding of what there is, how they create value, how do they find value. And I think culture then becomes this really important point where if you have a culture in a company that's really willing to leverage data and technology, help them create value, then you're already down the path. But culture isn't just at the top of the organization. Culture is one of the things that has to permeate the organization. So if you have your senior executives saying one thing about we're value driven, we're leveraging data and analytics, we're doing all this, and the people on the floor are basically using their gut to make decisions regarding inventory and pricing and merchandising, then the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm. I love that about, the company wants to be data driven and you say, no, you don't. You want to be value driven. I've got to keep that in mind because so many companies do say we're data driven. I say, well, are you really? Okay.
Yeah,
I'm gonna keep that.
What does that mean? You're data driven. You got a guy named Data who drives around your car? I don't know.
To your point, the idea of having access to all the data, making those good decisions. Sometimes a lot of people will look at the data and it doesn't confirm what they think because the data is actually not that good. The data is trying to tell them to go some different direction because humans do make complex decisions, and we don't necessarily realize how complex our thinking can be, bringing in lots of different data points. But also the opposite is absolutely true. Getting the data and it tells you something real and valid, but you go, nah, I don't feel that. I'm going to throw that out. And both circumstances cause you to distrust your data and analytics as well.
Can I build on that? That's a great point,
Please.
Andy. I think what happens is, we are using data that's, sometimes is questionable, is not maybe as accurate. And as you talked about earlier, disparate sets of data means that I might not even be using the right data set. I might be using the wrong one, right? It's been curated by somebody else in a different manner. It isn't the fact that we make bad decisions with the data. It's troubling that we don't measure how bad our decisions are so we can create an environment of continuous learning and adapting, right? I have a firm belief that in a knowledge-based industry, the economies of learning are more powerful than the economies of scale. And so it's okay to make bad decisions if you're learning from them. If you're looking at, what was wrong, what are the false positives and false negatives of the decision, and what am I doing to instrument and architect my system so that I'm learning from the false positive and false negative. So we shouldn't punish people for making bad decisions. In fact, we should empower people to front line to make decisions, but we should also ask of them that they're always feeding back what worked, what didn't work, and how can I make decisions better.
All right, so I think we have talked about this, but I'd like to get a really clear point or two in terms of, say there's some company out there that's struggling. They don't know what to do with their data. What advice would you give to those companies? How do they get more from it? How do they move forward? Andy, what advice would you give them?
Well, the one thing that I would say is do what I know my friends at Splunk would call a data source assessment. This is the idea of understanding all of these disparate data sets, right? Doing a structured review of your potential data sources, the different types of data, the different formats of data. Go methodically, system by system, application by application, and look at all of the data exhaust. What is there? You don't have to collect it yet, but understand what you have, catalog it, categorize it, start to understand what data intersects with what other data. And so you can start to look at these categories of data, and maybe it's sales, maybe it's production, logistics, certainly website, especially if you're retail, marketing data. All of this is really strong potentially, even individually, let alone across those boundary lines. And essentially looking for your richest data set. It's about mining the easy stuff first. Often that will be your website, for example. A lot of people don't really even know where to start. And so you start to think about, well, websites are obvious, easy to learn about your online visitors, especially if you've got any engagement or sales features on your website. Those weblogs are really rich. Just that. It's a single log. You don't even need to correlate. But looking at that and analyzing that data can tell you a lot about who's coming to your website, when, why, when are they leaving, where are they going when they leave. These are some pretty easy starting points. But even if you're already into analytics and doing it, understanding all of the data across the entire business, across the enterprise, with something like a data source assessment, I think just gives you a really solid footing to understand what more you can do and how data can help you do that.
Interesting. Bill, what would you add in terms of a couple of data points? I mean, piece of advice, how do we use our data better?
Well, the first question to me has always been, what's valuable to your company? I know as a data scientist, one of the things I always hated was that somebody would walk up to me and say, I got a data set here. Tell me what's interesting. Well, what do you mean? What's interesting? What's interesting to you? What's interesting to the business? And I guess it gets back to that, being data driven versus value driven. The whole process has to start with, well, how do you create value? And then, like Andy said, then you do this the data source assessment. You go through and you try to figure out what data you have. You take users through an envisioning process. We've run lots of envisioning workshops where you go through the realm of what's possible. And we got this data. What could you do? What would you? And I love this exercise we do, which is, what would you want to know about your customers or your operations or your products, right? What would you want to know? And if you knew that about them, what would you do differently? It's an exercise we take them through. It's really fun. They say, well, I'd want to know which of my customers are most likely to attract. Okay. Now we got something. We can work with that. So we can flight it. What would you do if you knew that? Right? What would you do if you knew this customer is going to attract? You're going to report it and whoopee, right? But you got to also then make sure that you've got this closed loop. You're going to put an action in place. You're going to try to prevent this person. You're going to run some sort of a treatment or a campaign or whatever it might be, maintenance on a product. And then you got to measure how effective it was. I did all this stuff. Did they actually leave or not? If you can't create this learning environment, the organizations are going to stagnate and they're going to get beat in the marketplace, because there are people, companies like what Andy's starting up here, right, who are going to come out of the woodwork and they're going to learn faster, right? The battleground isn't how big you are; it's how fast you are.
So really, your advice is sort of a meta. You go above the numbers. You're not down there looking at the data points exactly. You're up above, trying to figure out who you are, and then you go to the data.
Yeah, I mean, Andy said it really well. Organizations don't really know what data they have. They certainly have no idea what data is valuable to them. I love this story. I was talking to a CIO, and he was lamenting the stage of data catalogs, and he was telling me that he was very frustrated because he'd only been able to tag tag or instrument 10% of his data. Only, he spent all his time, he's only got 10% of it, put in a catalog. And I looked and I said, well, if that 10% represents 90% of the value, you're probably in good shape. Do you know what data is most valuable? And he looked at me like I had friggin' lobsters crawled out of my ears. Well, how would I know what data is most valuable? Well, that's the problem. Data in isolation of the business is just nothing. It's air. It's an empty promise. So again, I like to start my conversation with what's important to the organization. How do you create value? Then take them through this envisioning process that if you knew about your products, your operations, what would you do? And now we can start figuring out, well, do we have data that looks like that? Should we have data that looks like that? Which, by the way, drives lots of IoT opportunities in the operational space. Well, God, I guess we should probably tag that. We should probably instrument our environment that way. Mm-hmm. So again, I kind of look at this from a top down, but again, at some point in time, you do have to understand what data you have so you can figure out how you're going to apply it to these different opportunities.
And James, I'd like to maybe change my answer.
Please.
I think I'd like to actually say, I think you should hire Bill and do a workshop for you. But in all seriousness, Bill,
yes.
what you were saying there about understanding the possibilities is so true. Like having someone who can see the art of the possible, and ask. I love that question by the way, asking if you could know something about your competitor, your business, your campaigns, your production line, your logistics. What would you like to know, and what would you do with it? That is solid, Bill. So yeah, I'm changing my answer, James. It's called Bill for a workshop.
I like that. I like that.
I have to get a T-shirt with that on it. Call Bill for a workshop.
I'm going to buy that T-shirt. Bill, you mentioned IoT in there, which brings us to the idea of the tech itself. I mean, let's talk about a tech trend that's influencing how companies use data. I mean, the edge is certainly maturing. A lot of more data is crunched at the edge. AI is really coming on strong. It's helping humans process data, or so we're told. Is there a tech trend you'd point to that's really influencing how data is used? Andy, what do you see out there?
Yeah, look, James, I think edge is really interesting, right? I'm working at a video company, so the idea of edge and edge processing, everyone's got an edge device, by the way. It's called a smartphone, and
Right.
so many people are watching video on their smartphone. And so to be able to distribute video and send that and get information about how people are watching, where they're watching, why they're watching, how much of a video they're watching, when are they paying attention, when are they fast forwarding, how much of it are they listening to at 2 times speed versus how often are they watching it with audio on versus audio off? These sort of stuff we can do processing at the edge to understand that engagement behavior, even though that's all happening at the smartphone device. We can understand what's happening there. So I do think edge is really interesting. I tell you, James, I think one other significant trend that I'm seeing is an interesting, more open algorithm. Certainly we're getting this, politically, and I'm not going to talk too much about, the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters of the world and what they do with algorithmic processing.
Sure.
Even just consumers wanting to know about the algorithms being used for them and on them. So by online retailers, media organizations, ad agencies, social media, obviously, app stores, governments, employers as well, especially in this time of COVID, where there's an increasing and somewhat disturbing pattern of monitoring individual home users with data. And that can create all sorts of problems when you're looking at that kind of data. Like, what decisions are you making based on this? And how do you know you've got real data? Like, I saw something the other day. A company tracking the amount of time your keyboard was active, your screen was on, right?
Wow.
So there are devices you can buy that you plug in and they simulate a mouse. So every 20 seconds, it just goes on your mouse and it pretends to move. So your screen is always on. And so the data is getting gained, but what's the algorithm behind it? And so I think there's an interest in having more open algorithmic processing and understanding, well, what data are you taking in, how are you processing it, and why to make what decisions. There's a trust issue, I think, but just also an understanding that these algorithms can be used for good or evil in the old Maxwell Smart terminologies. And understanding how they're working gives people much more control over their own data and privacy and how they engage with that algorithmic processing.
I mean, you're really touching on the idea of ethics, which is a big hot button issue. The idea of explainability, and someone got a loan or did not get a loan, and can the algorithm explain why they denied or gave that person a loan? That's going to be a huge issue in the years ahead, no doubt. Probably some legislation coming. I
would assume so. I mean, legislatively, we're already starting to see rumbles in the United States. We've got different regulatory regimes in different countries and regions, of course, some better than others in my mind. But absolutely right, James. I've been looking at data ethics as a topic for a while now. And the idea of, and this is actually really important for individual contributors within data-driven companies, for want of a better word, Bill. The individuals have to make these choices sometimes. Is it right for me to program this algorithm in this way? Is it right for me to use this data set unaggregated or unanonymized? Sometimes it comes down to individuals to make decisions. And to be fair, some of those individuals don't necessarily know what's right for the business or for the community, or not necessarily understanding what the difference between what I can do versus what I should do.
Bill, your take. I mean, what's a technology trend that is really influencing the way we use these days?
Well, I want to build on what Andy was talking about. I do think class I'm teaching at Menlo right now is we have a section on data literacy and ethical AI, and I do think I'm totally infatuated with what we can do with AI. The realm of the possibles are outstanding. The realm of what can go wrong is also equally scary, and they cover it very well in movies. But we need to teach our kids, as well as everybody, more about where and how data is being used, both for their benefit and against them. We're doing an exercise about how to make informed decisions in an imperfect world, and we're going to explore the decisions whether to get a COVID vaccination or not trying to stand on one side or the other, but just looking at it from a data perspective and looking at the costs of the false positives and the false negatives. What is the cost of being wrong, and how are you using that information to help guide your decision? And this whole thing about explainable AI really comes to a head in me when we start seeing a lot of the confirmation bias that's built into some of the very early AI models. And people are saying, well, the data is biased. And I don't want to get into the bias data argument, because there's a real fine line between bias and preferences. We basically use preferences to give ourselves, greater user experience. And, the fact that I like the Chicago Cubs better than the Chicago White Sox, that doesn't make me an evil person. It just makes me, maybe an all-time loser for cheering for the Cubs. But anyway, the thing about the AI stuff that I think is really interesting is that you could really start to address the confirmation bias in AI models by instrumenting and learning from the false positives and the false negatives in the model. Let me give you an example. So let's say that you're hiring somebody, right? And you hire that person. I don't care what their demographics are ever, right? But the model has said you should hire that person. Okay, so you hire that person, and so you hire that person and they don't work out, right? They're a false positive. You thought they're going to be great, they weren't. They bombed out, you got rid of them. You have all this data about them, about they came in and failed, that you could feed into the market, into your models to basically learn from that false positive. The false negative gets really interesting. The person you didn't hire, and how do you instrument to find out when you made a mistake there, right? Einstein came in, he had crazy hair, stuck his tongue out, said, "Get the ass out of here," right? He said, "No," but right. So having an organizational commitment to trying to track and learn from the false negatives is really important, right? So how would you do that in a hiring decision? Well, you could call people, you could follow up with people, you could track them on LinkedIn to see what kind of job they got, you could sort of monitor their career. You could also start sprinkling A/B testing in here to find out, your model said don't hire this person. I'm going to hire this person to see if I can learn, right? And if they turn out to be great, well, you feed that back in. So I think there's a lot more on the AI model. It isn't just about building the model and then walking away from it. It's about how you're basically building these models using AI and machine learning, so they're continuously learning and adapting. And so that, again, that means you have to instrument the system, the models, to learn from the false positive and false negative. So it is becoming more accurate, and hopefully over time starts to overcome the bias that was maybe inadvertently built into the model.
On that note, I spoke with a vendor several weeks back, and she said to me that we have a system that scrubs from our algorithms. And I thought, wow, okay, that's a really complex process. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with her, but how do we scrub all bias from algorithms? That's a big question we can't answer, but it's going to be a question we face in the years ahead.
Yeah, to me, it's hard to scrub the data, the bias out, but I can certainly help to instrument the AI model so they learn from the biases and start to overcome them. To me, that's an easier problem. Because again, I think when you try to scrub bias out of the data, sometimes you're going to scrub all those important nuances that really drive that personalized customer experience. So it's a really fine line between biased data and preferences in the data. And I'm not smart enough to be able to tease those apart, but I think we can actually build AI models that can learn from the false positives and false negatives and overcome whatever might have been in the data to build it in the first place. So it's now learning and adapting more quickly on its own.
And James, I think most ML and AI, like most computer systems, sort of reflect the people who built them. And so I honestly feel one of the better ways to scrub bias from algorithms and data processing generally is to hire a diverse group of people to create the algorithms to do the data processing and analytics. But that's not going to be perfect. There's no doubt. You have to be very aware and conscious of the different biases you could bring into your own processing. You have to be conscious of the biases that getting one data set but not another data set might actually introduce. So insufficient data can be a bias generator in and of itself. But I do think that diverse hiring, and we know this in Silicon Valley, we need to do better at diverse hiring so that we get more sets of eyes and more lived experiences on both the data and the algorithm that's processing it, so they can start to highlight things that maybe other people wouldn't have even noticed.
Yeah, can I build? I think, and you got a really great point there. And when we think about building an AI model and the AI utility function around which the AI model is going to work, you do need to bring in a diverse set of stakeholders. Bring them in and understand what are the KPIs, metrics against which they're going to measure success or satisfaction. So you capture these whole things. So if you're a social media company and you're only optimizing on clicks, likes, and shares, right, you're going to end up with a certain set of behaviors out of your models. But if you expand that and you're looking at things like diversity, social activity, environmental concerns, right? If you broaden the KPIs, then we won't end up having the Terminators walk up down the streets killing us, right? We'll have a model that actually reflects sort of the more holistic goal that makes us humans.
Interesting. Well, speaking of such futuristic themes, what do we see in the years ahead? Say the middle of the decade or so. What is data analytics going to look like in those years? Andy, what do you predict?
Oh, James, I was actually talking with some of my team yesterday about the idea of making predictions and how accurate they can be, and whether I bother going back to look at my old predictions to see how wrong I was.
Right.
So I will say at the offset, I have no idea.
Sure. Good.
In my mind, I think it's about maturing markets. I think about technologies that came in that were exciting and different and new, but technology driven. And anything from video communication used to have to go to a studio, right? And now we just fire up a Zoom, we just fire up our smartphone, whatever it is. There's other things. Desktop publishing, you used to have to go to printers and types, offset printing and stuff like that. And now literally you just press a button and off you go. Web publishing. I don't need to know HTML or anything. I can just point and click and I've got a whole website running. Great. Right. That's the level of maturity I think analytics needs to get to. That'll be a benchmark for me, a milestone. When when analytics gets to the level that it's the ease of use, the ability to access actionable outcomes from essentially a point and click, drag and drop. You think about 4G programming, for example. But if I can do that from a smartphone, from a laptop, much the way that I can do video anywhere now, if I can do analytics anytime, anywhere, that's going to be a milestone for me. And that's going to really bump it up into high gear, because you're just going to get more eyes on analytical data and more opportunities to make more and better decisions.
Is that about a simple user interface? Is that the issue there?
It's partially the simple user interface. It's partially about that algorithmic transparency. So I know what the algorithm's doing, and I know if I plug this data in, I'm going to get something out that I can trust. It's definitely just to some degree just about, I don't want to know the algorithm, I just want to know the result. So notwithstanding, I want to know the algorithm's doing reasonable and fair and accurate things. I, as a business leader, don't need to know how it works, just that it works well and appropriately. And, and I mentioned Excel earlier on in passing, but Excel has fundamentally democratized the idea of scientific calculation. I don't need to know how these programs and functions look. I just plug it into an Excel cell, and it gives me an answer that I know how the algorithm works and I trust how it works. And that's available to any business user anywhere. I don't need specialized accounting software or SPSS or SAS or something. I do for more complex use cases, but if I'm just a business manager who wants to get my sales cycle better, I'm a production manager who wants to get just a little bit of efficiency out of my line, then as a manager, as a leader, I should be able to just plug my numbers in and get trustable, actionable data out. That's what I think is not just the UI, but yes, the UI, but also the bits behind it.
Interesting. So Bill, if you look into your crystal ball, you say that the middle of the decade, what would be some big milestones we should look for then?
So I'm going to sort of build on what Andy said. I think Andy's spot. I think we're going to see that tools are going to get easier to use. for the data consumers. You don't have to be the high priesthood of data scientists to start using these tools.
Right.
But
Low
we're going
code,
to see
no
them
code.
come down
That's
to,
a big thing.
and I think what we're going to see is that if we're looking to build, intelligent user experiences, it all starts with understanding user intent. What are people trying to do? And if we can build an interface that really tries to understand users' intent, then we can build interfaces that really, we see intent all the time. You go to Amazon and you type in what I'm looking for, and they give you all kinds of recommendations. You tell them your intent, and they give you all kinds of, as Andy said, you don't have to worry about how their models or algorithms work. You get what you're looking for. So I do think, like Andy said, that the tools are going to get better and easier. We're going to democratize the tools, really, not just democratize the tools, democratize the usability of the tools. And I do think we're going to see a move towards intent, because as consumers, we're spoiled by Netflix and Spotify and Amazon, because they know our intent and they can make recommendations that are very meaningful. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the big one prediction. I'm going to give another prediction the other direction, something that I think is going to continue to be a huge problem. And I don't know how we're going to solve it, which is data management across all these disparate data sources. And we got the edge growing dramatically. People don't have one cloud, they have multiple clouds. And if you start looking at Salesforce.com or Workday, those are all clouds too. You have this data, your data is scattered all over hell and back. And it's hard to manage all that. It's hard to bring it together. We've seen the world of data warehouses and data marts and data lakes. Now we're talking data lake houses and data fabrics and data meshes and data swamps and data. We have all these sort of intermediary sources out there trying to figure out how to bring data together. And as the data volume and speed grows, these artificial layers slow down the process and complicate it. So I think data management to me is the real Achilles heel of our area, and of our discipline, and how are we going to basically try to solve the fact that our data isn't going to be consolidated? We're not going to have it all in data lake. That's a fool's dream, right? And maybe it was a fool's dream. We started doing data warehouses in the 80s, right? It was never going to happen. It's even more so now that that's not realistic. And how are we going to address this data management problem so that if I have a better tool that understands my intent and I type in my intent, it knows where to go get the right data, wherever it may be located, and bring it to me to allow me to make a better decision.
I feel like the analytics tools themselves need to be built with predictive analytics, so they know where to go and what to do.
Bingo. I think Andy. I think you couldn't have said a bigger truth. I think that building intelligence into these tools, so if you know what your intent is, I'm looking to do customer analysis, I'm trying to figure out who my most valuable customers are. And the tool says, you got data here around customers, you got data here. You got features you've already built around customers, these scores, right? And it can basically help find those, bring them together, maybe even do like a Google page rank for you. These are probably the most relevant ones. So Andy, I think you're spot on. These tools, while we're building ML and AI, we actually need to start using it in our tools to help make it easier for us.
I think there's probably 50 to 100 startups, data startups right now who are thinking the same idea, thinking, how can we help manage this? And maybe one of them will come up with an answer. I mean, also the difficulty of that management is part of the rise of Snowflake. I mean, I think customers are going to Snowflake that can help us handle all this. At any rate, looking at the time, I think we're pretty much done for the day. But Andy, Bill, I think the two of you covered it. A lot of great stuff. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise today.
Thanks,
James. It's been such a pleasure to be here.
It's great. It's always, Andy, it's always fun to brainstorm with you. I got 2 pages of notes. So I talk, but I listen and learn as well.
I've ordered my T-shirt, the Bill Workshop T-shirt. So it's, it's coming.
I know. I desperately want one of those, man. I'm fan number 1 here, Bill.
Thanks, guys. I love it.